The scars on my hands? That wasn't from war. Not the kind you're thinking of. But the war I fought, most soldiers wouldn't have survived. I stood alone on the firing range at Fort Mason, Colorado, watching the recruits line up in morning formation. Their bodies were fresh, uniforms sharp, eyes still lit with the kind of pride that hadn't yet been tested. The sun hung low over the mountains, casting long shadows across the gravel and concrete. I'd been here 3 days in the same weathered civilian jacket, boots worn thin but holding. I didn't carry a clipboard, didn't issue commands. I watched. That was enough to make them nervous. They whispered when they thought I wasn't close enough to hear. About the scars, the way my fingers looked like they'd forgotten softness. The way my shoulders bore no insignia, no rank. To them I was a relic, a curiosity, or a mistake. Then the voice broke from their ranks, loud, clear, designed to sting. Did you lose your war, Grandma? Or just lose your mind? There was laughter. Short. Nervous. But it carried. I didn't turn. Not right away. Just stood there in the morning cold. Hands in my pockets, watching targets lined like ghosts in the distance. Then slow I smiled to myself. I took off my jacket. The cold bit into my arms, but I didn't feel it. I let them see the shoulder beneath, the chevron stitched in a dull, almost black thread, a pattern no one there could place. Because no military manual listed it. Because it wasn't supposed to exist. The laughter died fast. Even the wind seemed to hush for a moment. The instructors said nothing. I wasn't one of them. As far as they knew, I was oversight. Some retiree sent by command, perhaps an inspector who'd stayed past her time. They didn't ask questions. Not allowed. I stood there until the formation was dismissed, until the recruits scattered to their stations. I didn't move. Didn't need to. Their eyes avoided me after that. Except one. I caught him watching me. The one who'd called out, the boy with too much grin and not enough weight in his spine. He had his father's eyes, though he didn't know it yet. Mercer. Eli Mercer. The name was a punch I felt in my chest, but I kept it buried. He didn't know the shape of the past that stood in front of him. And I didn't plan to tell him. Not yet. That morning passed like the ones before it. Instructors yelling, boots pounding gravel, the sharp crack of rifles at the range. I watched them all, making no notes, taking no measurements. I'd already made my assessments. They just didn't know it yet. By noon, the sun had burned away the chill, leaving only the sting of dry air and sweat. I stayed near the shade of the observation shed. Eyes half-lidded but never closed. They thought I was some ghost of an old war shuffled into their midst to watch them fail. They weren't wrong. The days stretched thin, each one the same as the last. At Fort Mason, time wasn't kept by clocks but by the rhythm of drills and the bark of instructors. Recruits moved like gears in a machine, faces set, boots heavy with fatigue by evening. I remained at the periphery, silent. Every hour I stood, I was questioned without a word. Every glance flicked my way, every mutter carried low between breaths. I was a stranger among uniforms, unranked, unannounced, unsanctioned by any authority they knew. And yet I watched. The boy Eli Mercer watched me too. Less with curiosity now, more with irritation. He didn't like questions without answers, didn't like being ignored. Especially not by someone he tried to shame. His pride wouldn't allow it. The instructors assumed I was there to observe, a relic of oversight sent by command to grade their methods. I let them believe it. It kept them at arm's length. In the mess hall I ate alone. Simple rations, nothing warm enough to taste. The recruits whispered still but softer. I caught slivers of conversation, theories about who I was, what I'd done. Some said I was a failed commander. Some said I'd been discharged for madness. Others guessed I was someone's widow, come to haunt the grounds where her husband trained. They didn't know how close they were. And yet how far. I slept in a bare cot in the visitors' quarters. No photos. No medals. No trace of who I'd been. Every night I traced the chevron on my shoulder. The stitching had dulled, the edges frayed, but the mark remained. A phantom's mark. A symbol that wasn't supposed to exist because the unit that bore it didn't exist. Not in records, not in speeches, not in stone. Phantom unit. The name barely whispered even when it was real. It was in Myanmar that we died. Or most of us did. I was there the day the blackout operation went wrong. A Black Ops mission deep in the Shan Hills. No flags, no names, no protocols, only objectives. We were ghosts before we even landed. I can still hear the rotor's death rattle. The sky orange and split by flame. The screaming of the engine as it caught fire midair. The sound of bodies being tossed, weightless, before they slammed into earth. I remember crawling out of the twisted wreckage, every bone screaming, but moving because the others couldn't. I pulled them out, one by one as the flames licked closer. All but one. Captain Dale Mercer. I still see his face through the smoke, shouting for me to leave him. His leg pinned, the fire eating closer. His voice, commanding and pleading all at once, until it disappeared under the roar. I tried. God help me, I tried. But I didn't save him. I carried the others, burned, broken but breathing. We stumbled through miles of jungle, half dead, hunted by shadows that never wore uniforms. By the time we reached extraction, I wasn't the same. None of us were. The unit was dissolved after that. Not officially, we'd never existed. But unofficially, we scattered into silence, into new identities or forgotten ranks. I became a ghost long before I left the service. But I never forgot Dale Mercer. His voice still lives in my bones. And now his son stood here, loud and arrogant, too sure of his place, never knowing the weight he carried in his name. I said nothing to him. Not yet. Because I needed to know. Was he his father's son? Or just a shadow in a uniform? Days passed with drills and sweat, and still I stayed silent. I watched the instructors push them, correct them, dismiss them when they stumbled. Mercer didn't stumble. He thrived on proving himself better, faster. But he never looked where he was stepping. Never saw the paths others fell behind him on. He was pride wrapped in a private skin. Every so often, his gaze flicked to me, a question barely formed behind his eyes. I gave him nothing. One evening as the sun dipped low, Instructor Leanne Cross gathered the recruits in the close quarters combat hall. The air was thick with the smell of rubber mats, sweat, and frustration. She tried teaching them a maneuver, an advanced sequence for disarming and disabling with minimal motion. It wasn't going well. They moved like puppets, steps out of rhythm, hands uncertain. Mercer tried to. His effort was real, but his execution was wrong. He fought as if strength alone would win the move, not precision. Cross's voice cut the air, sharp and tired. She corrected, demonstrated, but the gap between her instruction and their understanding was a canyon. I stood in the shadowed doorway watching. I didn't speak, didn't flinch. When the lesson ended in frustration, the recruits dismissed, I lingered. Hours later, when the hall had emptied and the night settled over the base, I returned. Alone under the fluorescent lights, I stepped onto the mat. My boots off, feet planted, silent and sure. Then I moved. The maneuver was muscle memory. Flow, pivot, lock, disable. Movements meant to end a fight before it could start. My body, scarred and stiff, still remembered. The air hummed with the sound of steps practiced in shadows. I finished, breath steady, and looked up. Colonel Ray Collins stood at the edge of the hall, arms folded, eyes dark with thought. I didn't hear him enter, but I wasn't surprised. They should know, he said softly. I wiped sweat from my brow. They'll know when it matters. He didn't argue, just watched me for a moment longer before stepping back into the dark corridor, leaving me alone with the echoes. Tomorrow would come, and with it the reckoning. Not for me, for Mercer, for Dale's son. I still didn't know if I would save him, or if he was already too far lost in a name he didn't understand. It was the mountain that did it. The mountain always decides who a soldier really is. 3 days after the combat hall, a tremor shook Fort Mason. Nothing big, just a warning from beneath the earth. But no one paid it mind. Out here, these small earthquakes rattled through the valley every year, like distant cannon fire too far off to matter. That night, they sent the recruits up into the northern ridge for a night exercise. A 12-hour endurance challenge under rucksacks too heavy, maps half right, radios deliberately sabotaged by design. The instructors called it forging through shadow, a test of grit, leadership, improvisation. I stood by the motor pool as they departed, their silhouettes swallowed by dark trees. The wind smelled of soil ready to shift. I felt it in my bones. Collins stood near me, the brim of his cap low. He didn't speak, just watched the ridgeline. We both knew what the mountain was capable of. But orders were orders. Night fell heavy. The sky hung cloudless, but the air was wrong too still. I waited by the barracks, a habit I couldn't shake. In Phantom Unit, we always waited for the call that never came until it was too late. Then at 0210 hours, the ground split its seams. I was on my feet before the tremor finished. The ridge had given way, a fault line erupting deep under the forested hills. A shallow quake, but shallow meant surface-level violence. It hit them where they marched. Alarms rang across Fort Mason. Lights flicked on in the commander's office, vehicles roared to life, but I was already moving. I grabbed my boots, my jacket, my pack. I didn't wait for orders. By the time I reached the motor pool, Collins was there, radio pressed to his ear. The reports came scattered, full of static. Lost contact with half the units. Multiple injuries. Rockfalls. Pathways gone. He looked at me, eyes hard. You're not cleared for this. I shrugged on my pack. Good thing I'm not cleared for anything. He handed me a radio without argument. You take point. I ran. The path was treacherous, more so in darkness. My flashlight cut thin beams through the trees, but mostly I moved by memory, by the instinct of someone who has crossed landscapes designed to kill. Halfway up, I found the first group. 5 recruits, scraped and bruised, one with a dislocated shoulder. They looked up at me, faces pale and eyes wide. One tried to speak, but I was already checking their wounds. Follow, I said. Stay low. Stay close. We moved, inching past down trees and slabs of stone where the path used to be. I guided them to the lower pass, the one most maps didn't show. The one Phantom Unit once used when we trained for operations that didn't exist. Then I climbed higher, past where the air thinned and the earth was still shivering underfoot. That's when I heard his voice, hoarse, swearing, desperate. Mercer. I climbed toward the sound, scaling the incline until I reached a ledge cracked open by the quake. On the other side of the breach, Mercer stood with 3 others, their backs to a cliff edge, the ground unstable beneath their feet. He was shouting for help, trying to fashion a makeshift rope from belts and packs. His voice was sharp, but his hands shook. I called out, and his eyes snapped to me. His face changed then. Recognition, confusion, relief, but mostly disbelief. Stay put, I said. I'm coming. No, it's not stable, he called back. The ground's giving under. I didn't wait. I tossed a rope across the breach, anchored it to an old pine with roots deep enough to hold. One by one I pulled them across. A boy with a gash on his temple. Another limping from a twisted ankle. A girl barely 16 weeks into training. Her face bloodied but her jaw clenched tight. Then Mercer. He tied off the rope, but before crossing he paused. You shouldn't be here, he said, breathless. I pulled the rope taut. Neither should you. He crossed, each step careful, the ledge crumbling beneath his boots. When he reached me, he collapsed to his knees, gasping. We didn't speak. We just listened to the wind groan through the broken trees. I let them down. Every step, Mercer stayed close behind me, his pride too wounded to ask questions, but his silence loud with them. When we reached the base, the sun was breaking the sky open in soft gray light. The recruits gathered on the field, battered, exhausted, some in tears, others in silence. Collins stood before them, eyes heavy. He looked at me, then addressed them all. This is Colonel Sarah Maddox, he said, commander of the now decommissioned Phantom Unit. A ripple of confusion passed through the ranks. Collins' voice was steady. A unit so secret that no records remain. She wasn't here to observe your training. She came to see whether Private Eli Mercer was worthy of the uniform his father died wearing. Mercer flinched. His eyes locked on me, searching for something, confirmation, denial, anything. I said nothing. His father's name hung between us, heavier than any of the gear we carried off that mountain. The recruits dispersed slowly. The mountain had marked them all, but Mercer wore it different. The weight was personal now. That night I sat outside the barracks, the wind colder than before. Mercer found me there, footsteps slow, like he wasn't sure if he should even approach. You knew my father, he said. I looked up. His face was drawn, eyes hollow with the things he saw up there. The way the earth shifts under you when you think you're unbreakable. I did. He died in combat? I shook my head. Not combat. Not the kind they'll put in the history books. He swallowed hard. Did you leave him? I paused, the memory raw and close. I tried to carry him, I said quietly. But I wasn't strong enough. Mercer looked down, fists at his sides. His voice cracked, barely audible. You saved me. I nodded. I couldn't save your father, I said. But I can make sure his son never fights alone. I reached into my jacket, pulled out a cloth-wrapped object, and placed it in his hand. The Phantom Unit patch. The ghost chevron. He turned it over in his palm, eyes tracing the lines stitched by hands long dead. What do I do with it? He asked. Carry it, I said. Not for me. Not for him. But for the ones you'll keep alive when it's your turn. He held it like something sacred, though he didn't yet understand it. But he would. We stood under the empty sky, nothing but wind between us. Some ghosts aren't meant to be buried. Some just wait to be remembered. The ceremony came days later. Fort Mason's assembly hall was just concrete, steel beams and fluorescent light, bare bones, no grandeur. The recruits lined up in neat rows, eyes ahead, shoulders squared. Their uniforms looked sharper under the harsh lights, but I knew better. Every one of them was marked now by the mountain, by the quake, by the hours they thought death was coming up the trail behind them. The instructors filed in, their faces fixed in routine pride, clipboard formalities in hand. I stood at the back of the hall, leaning against the wall, just another shadow. They didn't acknowledge me. Not that they could, really. Not without admitting things they weren't supposed to know. Colonel Collins stood at the podium. His eyes swept the room, landing on the recruits like a surveyor taking measure of land too young to yield anything yet. His voice was precise as always. Today we honor the completion of initial combat training for Class 47. He called names. Assignments followed each one. A stream of orders placing them across the Army, some to Engineering Corps, others to Logistics, a few to combat units. 2 were marked for further evaluation by Ranger instructors. Then came the name we both knew was coming. Private Eli Mercer, Collins announced. Assigned to the Regular Infantry Division. The words hung in the air, heavier than they looked on paper. Mercer's eyes flicked to Collins, then found the floor. His fists tightened just enough that I saw the tremor in his knuckles. He stepped forward, accepted his assignment, saluted, and returned to formation. There was no cheer, no special distinction. He wasn't being sent to Special Forces. Not to Rangers. Just regular infantry. Some might have called it a demotion in spirit. But I knew why Collins had done it. Ghosts aren't born. They're made the hard way. Mercer wasn't ready yet. First, he needed to bleed with the living. The ceremony ended. The hall emptied, recruits chattering quietly, instructors dispersing to paperwork and briefings. I stayed where I was, still as the concrete pillars. Mercer lingered. He stood by his chair, the order still in his hand, crumpled slightly at the corner. His eyes tracked me, finally, directly. Question but no shame. He walked up to me, slow and certain. You knew my father, didn't you? I didn't answer immediately. I watched him, looking for the man beneath the name, beneath the boy who'd stood on a crumbling cliff calling out into the dark. He was my commanding officer, I said. Mercer looked down at the orders in his hand. His voice was softer now, unsure if it was even his to ask. What happened to him? I took a breath. Not deep, just enough to steady the memory clawing up from the years. Blackout mission, I said. Myanmar. Our unit went down. Helicopter was a coffin lit in flame. I got most of them out. But not him. No, I said. Not him. The way his eyes tightened, it wasn't anger. It was disappointment dressed as understanding. As if he'd always known the answer but needed to hear it anyway. Was he a good man? Mercer asked. He was the kind who yelled last and bled first, I said. That kind of good. Mercer swallowed, nodding to himself like a man trying to memorize the shape of a father he never knew. I don't want to be remembered like that, he muttered. A name. A story someone has to explain. Then don't be, I told him. I reached into my pocket. The cloth bundle. The Phantom Unit patch. Stitched, worn, the ghost chevron barely visible now. I placed it in his hand. He didn't ask what it was. He just looked at it. Like the fabric itself whispered of dead forests, smoke, and the names of men who never made it home. What am I supposed to do with it? He asked. Carry it, I said. Remember it. For what? For the day you're the last one standing, I said. When someone looks at you for orders because no one else is left. He folded it carefully like it might fall apart. I clapped a hand on his shoulder. The first time I'd touched him, the muscle there was solid. Not yet tempered but not soft either. You're not your father, I said. Don't try to be. Be the man who carries his own ghosts. He nodded once. As he turned to leave, he paused. Thank you, he said. Quiet. A boy's voice still learning how to sound like a man. I watched him walk out of the hall, his silhouette caught in the rectangle of light where the door stood open. That was the last time I saw him in uniform. Somewhere downrange, the world would either break him or forge him. I stayed in the hall a while longer. The lights buzzed overhead, a soft and steady hum like the world breathing. I wasn't waiting for applause. There was no commendation for the ghosts of wars that never officially happened. No medals for memories that still screamed under the surface of sleep. But I stood there anyway because ghosts have nowhere else to go. When I finally left, the sky was bruising into twilight. The mountains stood silent, holding their secrets in shadow. Some battles don't end. They just change hands. I didn't stay long after the ceremony. There's an unspoken rule with ghosts: we don't linger. Not where the living need space to build themselves up. I packed light. One duffel. The jacket. The patch stitched to the inside lining, where no one but me could touch it. I'd given Mercer his, but I still carried the original. The one stained by the jungle mud of Myanmar. By ash and blood that never fully washed out. I didn't leave a forwarding address. There was no one to write to. Collins knew better than to ask where I'd go. He stood by the gates when I walked past, his face still and unreadable. You did what you came for, he said. I nodded. Did I? He shrugged. Time will answer that. We didn't shake hands. Ghosts don't need ceremony. We simply recognize each other in silence. I walked past the gate, out into the world that forgets soldiers faster than they're made. The sky was heavy with clouds, the air cold but not yet the sharpness of winter. The wind coming off the Colorado range carried the scent of pine and stone. The road stretched ahead, cracked and worn, leading nowhere in particular. I walked. Every mile turned memory loose. I thought of Dale Mercer, of his voice behind the roar of the helicopter engines, shouting orders to keep the perimeter clear, bleeding from a leg crushed beneath the cabin wall. His voice cutting through the panic, his eyes locked on mine when the flames were too close, when the choices ran out. I carried his men out. Every last one I could drag, push, lift. But not him. I remembered turning back, his face swallowed by the smoke. His last words carried like a failing radio signal. Get them home. That was it. I obeyed. But the cost of obedience is weight. The kind that doesn't leave your shoulders, even when the bones beneath them start to give. I carried him with me through every mission after that. Through every debrief where the maps were burned and the names erased. Through the days when phantom units still existed in the shadows of wars that didn't make headlines. And through the years after the unit was scrubbed, deactivated, rendered non-existent by the same hands that built it. We became phantoms in truth. Soldiers whose stories couldn't be told because no one wanted them to exist in the first place. I kept walking. Towns passed in blurs of asphalt and steel, faces without names. I slept in motels when I needed a roof, beneath trees when I didn't. I wasn't headed anywhere. Just away. Ghosts move better without destinations. Now and then, I'd see a soldier's posture in a stranger on the road. The squared shoulders, the eyes that flicked too quick between exits and crowds. I'd nod to them. They never nodded back, but I knew they saw me. We always see each other. Weeks passed like that. One morning I woke to a sky heavy with snow clouds. The wind bit deeper than before. The first flurries dusted my jacket as I crossed a ridge road somewhere north of nowhere. At a diner off the highway, I sat by the window with a cup of black coffee. No sugar. No cream. A television hung in the corner, the volume low. Just enough to catch the headline ticker as it rolled across the screen. Infantry unit engages in hostile firefight. Private Eli Mercer commended for valor. I stared at the screen. There was a grainy photo. His face, dirted and tired, but alive. Alive and standing. I sipped my coffee, the bitterness sitting comfortably on my tongue. He'd made it through his first fire. There was a long way to go, but he'd survived the first one. That counts. The waitress, a woman too tired to ask questions, refilled my cup without a word. I left the diner at dusk. The snow was coming down harder, softening the world's sharp edges. I stood by the roadside a while, staring up at the blank sky, flakes melting into my skin, into the fabric of my jacket, into the scarred grooves of my hands. I traced the patch inside my coat. Phantom Unit. We never had a motto. We weren't allowed one. But if we had, it would have been this. Leave no one if you can. Remember the ones you couldn't. I kept walking until the snow turned the road into a ghost of itself. The sky was a heavy lit, no stars, no moon, just the gray bruise of night. I took shelter in a derelict service station off the old highway. The roof sagged, walls marked by decades of graffiti and rot. But it was enough to stay dry. The wind cut through the broken window frames, and I didn't bother trying to block them. I lit a small fire in an old oil drum with the scraps of paper and wood I could find. The flame was weak but steady. The heat reached only as far as my knees, but that was enough. I sat with my back against the cold concrete wall, knees bent, jacket pulled close. I pressed a hand to the inner pocket where the original Phantom Unit patch lay folded. The firelight traced the scars on my hands. The ones they whispered about back at Fort Mason. Not from shrapnel, not from blades or bullets. The scars came from pulling men out of fire. From grasping steel too hot to hold, skin peeling away because you don't let go of a man's body just because it burns. From lifting weight that tears tendons because letting it drop means leaving someone behind. You pay for every life you save. You pay in flesh, in nights without sleep, in the ache that never leaves your bones. But the lives you couldn't save? You pay for those with every breath. The fire crackled, shadows jumping across the walls. I pulled the patch from my pocket, held it between thumb and forefinger, studying the threads. A chevron, overlaid with a faded specter of a blade. The design warped by years and wear. No one recognized it anymore. No one but the few of us still walking, and fewer still who'd admit we ever wore it. Somewhere Mercer carried his copy. I wondered if he kept it close or if he'd stuffed it into a duffel, forgotten, like some token from a story he didn't yet know how to tell. I figured I'd never know. That was all right. I'd done what I came to do. Snow piled at the doorframe. The wind whistled through the broken panels, but I stayed there, warming my hands, letting the scars remember what the world had forgotten. At some point I must have slept. I woke before dawn. The cold biting deep enough to rattle my ribs. The fire dead, just blackened ash and a thin smell of smoke. I packed the patch away, stood, brushed the dust and frost from my clothes, and stepped back into the snow. The sky was a pale smear, the sun trying but failing to rise properly. The road stretched empty in both directions. I took the one heading east. I always moved east when I didn't know where else to go. Old habit, like chasing the light, even if it never really reached me. By midday, I crossed into a small town, name long since rusted off the road signs. A market, a diner, a gas station still operating. I stopped for coffee. The man behind the counter didn't ask questions, didn't stare. Just poured and slid the mug my way. On the wall, a small TV flickered with news from some war zone abroad. Sand, smoke, men shouting over gunfire. A journalist's voice cutting in, sterile and practiced. I watched without watching. The counterman noticed my stare. "You serve?" The question was casual, innocent. I nodded. "What branch?" I didn't answer. Not because I didn't want to, but because there was no good answer to give. "Long time ago," I said. He didn't press. I paid in crumpled bills and left. The road continued. My boots crushed the slush and salt on the roadside. The air stung with cold. As I walked, I thought of Mercer again. Somewhere he was learning, fighting, maybe bleeding, maybe stitching someone else up, maybe telling himself he'd never end up like the ghost of a woman he once insulted on a firing range in Colorado. Good. Let him carry that. Let him carry it far enough that one day, when some kid stands before him, still green, still stupid, he'll understand the weight of legacy. That's all a ghost can ask. To leave something behind that remembers. I walked until the light thinned and the air grew colder. The road was endless. It always is. Evening came like a closing hand. fingers of dust curling the sky into darkness. The road ahead blurred with shadow and frost, and still I kept walking. There was nowhere I was headed. Ghosts don't have destinations, only the next step. Always the next. I stopped by a ridge overlooking the highway below. Cars passed, headlights cutting through the dark, each beam fleeting, gone before it could light more than a few feet ahead. That's how memory works, I think. Brief illuminations, glimpses, then gone. I stood there a while, watching the world forget itself mile by mile. I thought of Fort Mason, of Mercer, of Collins, of the faces in that formation staring when I shed my jacket and showed them a symbol their manuals could never explain. And I thought of Dale Mercer. I still hear his voice when I sleep light enough for dreams. The weight of his name, of his son's face, of the choice I made to keep moving while he burned. You carry that. You never set it down. I reached into my jacket and touched the old patch. The threads worn thin but still holding. There was comfort in that. That things can fray, lose color, lose form, but still remain. I kept walking. Not because there was a place to reach, but because to stop would mean to forget. And I am not done remembering. Some battles leave no medals, no witnesses, no records. But the legacy of duty survives, in those who choose to carry it forward. Unseen, unforgotten. And I intend to walk until the weight of memory finds the next hand strong enough to hold it.